They thought he was just a lonely old man with chickens and cattle. No family, no threats, just silence and routine. But when a cartel crew broke into his barn, they triggered something buried deep. Jack Landry hadn't spoken about his past in decades, not about the room beneath the floorboards, not about the names still etched in red ink, and definitely not about what he used to do for the CIA. What happens when ruthless criminals underestimate a man trained to break the unbreakable? This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the kind of silence that watches and waits. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The wind rolled low across the dry grass, carrying the dust with it like smoke from a fire long gone out. The land out here didn't move much. It creaked, it settled, it aged without anyone watching. No highway noise. A man builds himself out of barbed wire and the occasional prayer. On the edge of nowhere, past the town of El Silencio, if you could even call it a town, sat a rust-colored barn half sunk into the dirt like it had been left behind by a more ambitious decade. The boards were warped, some split from sun and time, tin roofing patched with rusted sheet metal, and just beyond the fence line, a line of cattle moved slow, heads down. As if the heat had made philosophers of them all, Jack Landry leaned into the gate with one hand, the other resting on a wooden cane that had outlasted 2 surgeries and 5 good winters. His hat cast a long shadow over his eyes, but not enough to hide the way they tracked everything. He watched like someone who had once needed to, like a man who hadn't entirely forgotten what that meant. Every morning at 5:45, he was out here. Christmas, or if he'd woken up, aching in places. They never gave names to it. The land had a rhythm, and Jack Landry kept it. The people in town, what few were left, figured he was just another rancher who didn't like talking, didn't go to church, and didn't smile when he didn't have to. A widower, they said, keeps to himself. No trouble, just quiet. But the land remembered things even when people didn't. And Jack Landry's quiet was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of knowing how loud things could get. He moved with the slow precision of a man who had once moved fast. Each step calculated not because of weakness, but because of habit. The kind of habit that had been trained into him across too many borders, in too many languages, with names and missions that no longer existed on paper. And the pocket knife clipped to his belt was older than the last 5 presidents. He fed his cattle, checked the fencing, walked the full perimeter every single day, even when the knee barked and the back sang a warning. Afford not to know what crossed his land. The barn stood at the center of the property, its doors chained and padlocked even though no one ever came out this way. Inside were the usual things: tools, feed, a stack of unused lumber, but deeper in, past the false wall behind the rusting seed spreader, was something that hadn't seen daylight in 20 years. A reinforced trapdoor flush with the floor, disguised beneath bags of feed and a retired wheelbarrow. Jack hadn't opened it in over a decade, but he'd touched the lock last night. Just touched it, as if making sure it still knew who he was. Out near the south fence line, a crow hopped from post to post, squawking like it had something urgent to say. Jack squinted into the sun. His land stretched wide, flat, and golden and forgettable. But Jack never forgot. He reached the porch right as the sun slipped above the hills. The kettle inside had already begun to whistle. A shotgun leaned behind the screen door, just like always, not for show, not loaded with birdshot. The mail never came this far, and Jack Landry didn't keep a phone in the house. Only a radio in the barn loft, low band, civilian range disabled. Eyes following the cattle line, then the horizon beyond it. Somewhere in the distance where the grass grew thinner and the coyotes didn't bother howling anymore. Many things before. Quiet, still waiting. The days didn't vary. Jack Landry's life unfolded like a loop, wound tight around habit and repetition. At first light, the cattle got fed. The troughs filled with dry feed. Then came the water. Chexos lines flushed, spigots tested. He walked the fences by mid-morning, one boot in front of the other, his cane dragging a line in the dirt beside him. Every wooden post was touched, every strand of barbed wire checked for slack. He carried spare staples in the left pocket of his jacket, a coil of wire in the truck, just in case. It wasn't that the fence needed that kind of daily scrutiny, it was that Jack needed it. When the heat rose past 90, he'd retreat to the barn's shade. He'd work on the tractor or run maintenance on the generator, hands always occupied. Lunch came around 11. Sandwich, apple, water, no deviations. In the afternoons, he kept to the tool shed, fixing things that didn't need fixing, sharpening blades that rarely saw use. He sat on the porch as the sun dropped low, drank coffee like clockwork, and stared toward the road like he expected it to deliver something other than dust. People in El Silencio had their own explanations for Jack. They said his wife had passed, some years back cancer, maybe, or something else no one could confirm. They remembered she used to teach 3rd grade in town, quiet but kind, always wearing those floral dresses and carrying books. When she died, Jack stopped coming into town except for feed and fuel. He spoke politely at the hardware store, nodded. Once at the post office, but rarely stayed long. Some said the grief had hollowed him. Others figured he'd always been that way, and his wife had just made him easier to understand. What they didn't know, or chose not to ask about, were the lights. Out past midnight, sometimes as late as 3, there were reports. A faint glow. From the barn's loft window, the back room lit up when no trucks were parked nearby. Once a teenager passing through said he saw a figure standing on the roof, a silhouette, unmoving, staring out across the field. Sheriff Torres had driven by once on a slow night just to check. He saw nothing unusual. The barn dark, the house quiet, but he swore he'd heard a faint electrical hum, like something powering down as he approached. He didn't stop the car. No one ever saw visitors. No deliveries beyond the standard farm. Supply truck every 3rd Wednesday. No mail beyond the occasional government envelope, and yet the barn locks were changed every month, like ritual. The satellite dish behind the shed wasn't pointed at anything that made sense. And once, during a summer brush fire that burned close to Jack's southern fields, a firefighter reported that the barn's walls were reinforced steel beneath the wood siding. When asked about it, Jack had simply said, "Keeps the heat out," and offered the man a bottle of water. They left it alone, because Jack didn't cause problems. And because the kind of silence he carried wasn't the ordinary kind. It felt too practiced, too dense. People instinctively stepped back from it, like it could stain them. Inside the house, the furniture was old but clean. Nothing personal on the walls, no photographs, no awards, not even a calendar. The living room had a fire-safe box bolted into the wall behind a bookshelf, its dial worn smooth. A spare key was hidden behind a vent that wasn't connected to anything. The attic had a false ceiling. The basement didn't have one at all, just concrete and steel, a room without windows. He shaved every morning with a straight razor, ate the same meals on the same plates, kept every pair of shoes lined up precisely in the mudroom, soles scrubbed. His past didn't show itself in scars or stories. It showed itself in systems, in routines so tight that they left no room for questions, no loose ends. When he walked the fields, he never whistled, never sang. But once, a hawk passed low overhead, and he looked up just long enough to murmur something in Russian. The wind carried it off, and no one heard. But Jack Landry never said anything by accident. The call came at 7:12 in the evening. Jack had just settled into his porch chair, a ceramic mug cooling in his hand, the coffee already half forgotten. He didn't recognize the number. He rarely answered calls that came without names. But something about the timing, about the silence just before the first ring, made him reach for the phone anyway. He pressed the green button and waited. "Dad," the voice said. It was younger than he remembered, tired but steady. "It's me, Nathan." Jack didn't respond right away. The last time they'd spoken, it was across a hospital bed, both men standing on opposite sides of grief they didn't know how to name, that had been nearly 4 years ago. Now the voice sounded worn down, clipped like a man used to giving reports no one listened to. "I'm not calling for a talk, Nathan," said. "This is work-related." Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the silence hold. If the boy knew the man wanted something, he could say it plain. "We intercepted chatter," Nathan continued. "A new route. Cartels testing smaller corridors to move things faster, not main highways, not established paths." Jack's jaw tightened slightly, though his face remained still. He said nothing. Some of the abandoned ranches south of El Silencio have been tagged. Unoccupied structures, quiet properties. Yours is near the top edge of that sector. The coffee in Jack's hand had gone cold. He set it down without drinking. "I'm not exactly unoccupied," he said flatly. "I know that," Nathan replied. "But from the air, from a map, it looks like every other forgotten property. They're testing for response times. No enforcement coverage out that far. Nothing to signal resistance." Jack breathed through his nose. "You calling as a warning or as an officer?" There was a pause, a long one. Then both. "I can handle myself," Jack said. It wasn't bravado. It was a statement of fact, delivered without ego. "I know," Nathan replied, "but you need to understand they're not just trafficking packages. Some of these guys are trying to prove themselves, new crews, green and desperate. They're armed, they're careless, they don't see lines, they see convenience." Jack stared out at the field. The cattle had gone still under the deepening sky. The wind had died down, the trees no longer rustling. The land held its breath. "Anything already happened near me?" he asked. "Not yet," Nathan said, "but 2 properties west of you burned. Out chicken coop on one, empty garage on the other. Entry signs, minor damage. No confrontation, just scouting, but we don't know if they're coming through again or just testing fences." Jack nodded once, though no one could see it. "I'm not supposed to be calling you with this," Nathan added. "Just so you know, this isn't protocol. You think I'll report it?" "No," he said. "I think you'll do the opposite. That's what worries me." Jack allowed the edge of a smile, brief and humorless. "I don't go looking for trouble, son." "No, but you don't walk away from it either." The silence that followed wasn't cold, just weighted by years, by choices neither of them had undone. Finally, Jack spoke. "I'll take care of the property," I figured. The line lingered another beat before Nathan said, "I've got to go. Stay alert. Always do." Then the call ended. No goodbye. Jack set the phone down on the table. Beside the mug, the sky was darker now, just a faint glow lingering in the west. He stood, slowly, joints stiff. Then he walked toward the barn without turning on a single light. Inside, he unhooked the lantern from its nail, lit it with practiced hands, and descended the 3 steps to the back wall. The air smelled of old oil, hay, and dust. He crouched beside a workbench and reached behind a stacked crate. When his hand came back, it held a small rusted key. He didn't use it yet. He just held it in his palm for a while, eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath him. Where dust hadn't gathered in a perfect square, the key had weight. So did what it opened. The wind that night carried more than dust. It whistled low and slow, pushing dried grass across the field in hushed waves, like whispers too soft to understand. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the only light in the room coming from the small bulb above the stove. The rest of the house was shadowed. A half-empty mug sat cooling beside him, untouched for nearly an hour. He hadn't moved much, just sat still, one hand resting flat against the grain of the table, fingers occasionally twitching when the breeze outside changed direction. Then he heard it again. It wasn't the cattle. They were penned far off to the west, and besides, they didn't move like that. It wasn't the wind either. Wind didn't pause between steps. A subtle hush followed the movement, like the land was holding its breath around whatever was crossing it. South fence, close. He didn't reach for a weapon, not yet. He didn't rise, didn't turn on any lights, didn't step onto the porch to scan the field. Instead, he stood, slowly, and made his way down the hallway, his steps deliberately soft. The floor creaked once near the baseboard heater, but he didn't react. In the bedroom, he passed the dresser, ignored the closet, and knelt beside the bed. He reached underneath. There was a wooden box tucked between the floor joists. The box was plain. Pine, no varnish, reinforced at the corners with rust-flecked metal. The lock was older than the house, not decorative, functional. It had been set once and never touched since. Jack ran his thumb along the latch, then stood, and moved to the nightstand in the drawer beneath an old receipt from a feed store and a folded church bulletin from 3 Easters ago. Was a small key wrapped in medical tape. He unwrapped it slowly, his fingers steady despite the cold in the room. He knelt again and slid the key into the lock. It clicked, clean and quiet. When he opened the box, the smell hit first metal and oil, paper and age. No dust. 3 items arranged with exact care: a worn leather notebook, a small matte black pistol with a threaded barrel and a folded cloth bundle the size of a man's hand. One's meant for building, one's meant for breaking things down. Lockpicks, a wire cutter, a glass scorer, a tiny flashlight with a blue filter. Each piece had its place. Jack lifted the notebook last. The pages inside were brittle but well preserved, handwritten in block letters. Some pages contained coordinates. Others listed names, not full names, just surnames, locations, dates, and red underlines. One entry read, Aguero, 2007. Border familiarity. Avoid until confirmed. Jack's eyes stopped on the last few pages. More recent, they were different. Diagrams, layouts, a schematic for a buried structure, all angles and air vents. He turned back to the front page. At the top, scrawled above the first list of names, were two words in faded ink. Kilo Echo. He stared at the words for a long time, not because he didn't recognize them, but because he did. That was a name they used for him once, a ghost name for assignments they didn't want traced. He hadn't thought of it in years. It was never supposed to follow him home. Jack closed the notebook gently and returned it to the box. This time, he didn't lock it. He stood, crossed the room, and went to the hallway closet. From behind a shelf of folded towels, he pulled out a heavy canvas bag, set it on the bed, unzipped it. Inside, everything was just as he had left it. Not pristine, but not forgotten either. Items from a life he no longer claimed. But tonight, something had shifted. Something had stepped onto his land. And Jack Landry didn't believe in coincidences. The next morning came quietly, as if the night hadn't left its mark. The sun rose slow over the dry fields, painting the barn in soft gold and the grass in shades of brittle green. Jack had already fed the cattle by the time the sun cleared the hills. His movements were the same, deliberate and practiced, but there was something new in his eyes, something calculating. After he returned to the house, he didn't bother with breakfast. He locked the door behind him, drew the shades, and returned to the bedroom with the same steadiness he used to clear buildings in a different life. The lockbox still sat, open on the floor where he had left it. This time, he removed everything. The notebook went to the table. The pistol and tools were set aside, wrapped again with care. Beneath the false bottom of the box, he found what he knew would still be there, manila folder, yellowed with age, and thick with creases from too many transfers. A corner had been torn off, but the writing remained clear in faded black ink. All capital letters. Kilo Echo. He laid it flat on the table and opened it slowly. The first page was a field summary handwritten, some of it in code. The cover sheet referenced multiple operations: AEGIS, Ground, Mirrigate, and Stoneflint. Beside each title were dates ranging from 1987 to 2002. Some were redacted, some weren't. Each was marked with his call sign, Kilo Echo. He turned the page. There were photographs next, black and white surveillance prints, most taken at long range. Men in trucks, men with rifles, slung casually over their shoulders. Some showed warehouse doors being pried open under night vision. Others showed satellite stills heat-mapped fields, rooftops with false vents, roads that weren't on any civilian map. Each photo was labeled location, date, subject. A photo clipped to the next page stopped him, cold. It showed a man standing at a market stall in Makokan, wearing sunglasses and holding a plastic bag. A woman beside him. The man's face was blurred by shadow, but Jack recognized the posture, the hangs, the angle of the hips. Herrera, a name that had come up again and again in the field, but never confirmed. Underneath the image, someone had scribbled in red, Herrera active, moving north. Herrera, follow authorized. Jack flipped to the next section, handwritten notes on narrow sheets, each one an after-action summary. Many were in shorthand, some in cipher. A few were direct, blunt language, short sentences. Extraction failed, assets lost. Kilo Echo pulled before second phase. Local ally compromised, no recovery. Informant status unknown, trust gap identified. Deep cover may be compromised, post 2002. The ink varied, some pages blue, some black, a few typed. The red markings, however, were always the same. Underlined circles and X's over particular names. A kind of internal scoring system. Names with double red lines meant confirmed threats. Those with question marks meant unfinished business. He reached the final section of the folder and found a folded map. It was a border grid Texas and northern Mexico overlaid with pen markings and translucent tape. Dotted lines tracked smuggling corridors, most now obsolete. But one line had been updated in pencil. Faint, recent. It cut directly through the empty farmland west of El Silencio, arcing just along the perimeter of Jack's property before veering north toward an abandoned mill. He traced it with his finger. If someone had gotten access to old routes, reactivated them, it meant someone with institutional memory, someone who either had Jack's old reports or had worked with him once. That line, its precision, the way it hugged the terrain, hadn't been drawn by accident. It was tactical. It was intentional. He folded the map, replaced it in the folder, then sat back in the chair. In the corner of the living room, an old shortwave radio sat on a shelf behind a dusty stack of manuals. Jack stood and powered it on. He tuned it to a dead channel, letting the static wash over him. He wasn't listening for words, just patterns, bursts. The mirror in Jack's bathroom was small and unremarkable. The frame was wood, plain and unvarnished, nailed into the wall sometime in the 70s. It had survived storms, a renovation he never finished, and the slow rot of time. It had also survived him. He leaned forward now, both hands braced against the sides of the sink, the veins in his forearms raised under skin that was thinner than it used to be. The mirror caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the creases fanned out beneath his eyes, and the pale scar that curved beneath his left eye socket like a crescent moon. He had told people it came from barbed wire, from an old buck caught in a fence. He told the same story enough times that no one questioned it. The air heavy with dust and electricity, a man in the chair bound at the wrists, blood on his lip, and the stink of fear rising off him like steam. Jack had leaned in too close. That was the mistake. The prisoner had lunged, the cable slack just long enough to allow a single, desperate strike. Fingernails caught his cheek. Not enough to do damage. The man didn't last long after that. Jack touched the scar now, his fingertips rough from work, pressing lightly into the tissue. It had faded, but not disappeared. The agency had offered to remove it cosmetic procedures, part of a thank you package he never cashed in. He refused. A scar was memory you couldn't misplace. He needed that. He looked at himself fully then, really. Looked. The man in the mirror wasn't young, but he wasn't broken. The shoulders were still squared, the spine still straight. The eyes were steady, dark, and distant. Not much had changed, not really. He had just buried himself under years of quiet, cattle, fencing, dust, but it was all still there. He reached into the cabinet under the sink and pulled out a small canvas pouch. The zipper caught for a moment, then gave way with a dry rasp. Inside were clippers, a straight razor, and a bottle of antiseptic. His fingers moved automatically, muscle memory doing the work. He trimmed his beard close, shaved with slow precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation, and returned everything to its place. He stared at the clean-shaven face that looked back at him. The lines were sharper, the jaw firmer. He looked like the man he used to be, the man the agency had trained, the one they sent into places that didn't exist on maps. Not all interrogators operated with fists. Jack rarely did. He didn't need to. He had learned the rhythms of fear, the tempo of uncertainty. His talent wasn't in extracting penet, was in planting doubt. In asking the same question 100 ways until the answers began to slip, until time collapsed in on itself and the subject couldn't remember what they'd admitted. And when words failed, Jack knew how to wait. Silence could break a man faster than a blade. He hadn't thought about those rooms in years, but they came back now, whole, undemmed. He turned from the mirror and made his way into the hallway, past the photographs that had never been hung, past the phone that never rang. He moved to the living room, where the folder still sat open on the table. Jack Landry was a rancher. Yes, that part was true. But long before this land, long before the cattle and the feed store and the neighbor, who waved once a month, he had been something else, something they never quite retired. Now, the land was stirring, roots reactivated, trespassers that didn't belong. And Jack wasn't sure yet who was behind it. But he knew one thing with certainty: if they came looking for weakness, for soft targets, for a man too old to notice, they had chosen the wrong barn. The canal at the edge of Jack's property was shallow and slow-moving. Little more than a man-made trench carved years ago to direct irrigation runoff from neighboring farms. It hadn't carried a full stream in over a decade, but it still served as a natural boundary line, one that separated Jack's land from the open scrub to the south. The fence along that stretch had held more or less a few rusted sections, posts sagging in places, but it was the kind of terrain no one crossed unless they meant to. That morning, Jack spotted something before he even stepped out of the truck. Tracks, not the heavy tread kind, left by ranch vehicles, and not the scattered hoofprints of stray cattle. These were clean, shallow impressions, wide tires, low pressure. Exactly the kind used on modified off-road trucks preferred by certain crews who moved cargo under the radar. He didn't need to get close to recognize the pattern. He'd seen it enough years ago in Central America, where similar trucks ran along banana routes under false company names. Different continent, same purpose. He knelt by the tracks without a word, fingers brushing the soil just to confirm what his eyes already told him. Still soft. No more than 24 hours old. No rain since Thursday, and no reason for anyone to be here unless they were testing boundaries. The tracks followed the canal for a few hundred yards before doubling back toward the scrub brush. No breach in the fence, but the gatepost showed signs of handling just enough pressure to test the integrity of the latch. Jack stood slowly, brushing dirt off his palms. His face didn't show anger or fear, just calculation. He returned to the truck, turned the key, and backed out onto the road with no rush in his movement. Not a glance over the shoulder, just a steady drive west, tires humming low against the faded asphalt as he headed toward town. Silencio was smaller than it had been even 5 years ago. Half the shops along Main Street were closed now, windows taped over with brown paper, the for-lease signs curling at the corners. The feed store remained, as did the gas station. And the hardware supplier, that's where Jack parked, just outside a place called Burke's. A squat concrete building with a single bell that jingled when the door opened. The man behind the counter looked up and gave a tight nod. "Jack, need a few things," Jack said, his voice flat but polite. "Trail cameras, motion activated, low light capable." Burke nodded and moved toward the back aisle. "You checking for coyotes again?" Jack didn't answer right away. "Something like that?" They walked the aisle in silence. Jack picked out 3 cameras, then added a coil of weatherproof wire and a small toolkit. At the register, he added 2 heavy-duty padlocks, the kind with reinforced steel bodies and double ball bearings, not over-the-counter stuff, the kind you only stocked if you had reason to expect trouble. Burke glanced down at the locks. "Been a while since you needed these." Jack met his eyes. Fence lines feeling soft, Burke didn't push. He just nodded and rang everything up back outside. Jack placed the bags in the passenger seat, double-checked the receipt, then reached into the glove box for a marker. He circled the purchase date and underlined the camera model numbers. Paper. Record, just in case. The drive back was just as steady as before. No rush. He passed the same 3 pickup trucks heading in the opposite direction. No one looked twice at home. He parked near the barn and carried the gear inside. The shadows stretched long now, and the wind had picked up. He laid the cameras out on the workbench, checking battery compartments and memory cards. Then he turned to the barn's back door and replaced the old latch with one of the new locks. Clicked it shut, tested the tension, did the same for the side gate near the fence. The last thing he did before the sun dipped was walk the south line again. The tracks were still there, still fresh, but this time they weren't alone. Now there was a camera mounted in the crook of an old mesquite tree, angled low, watching Dot, just like Jack. The barn sat in its usual place at the edge of the property, framed by a slant of dry light and the steady hum of insects rising from the grass. Jack pulled the truck around slowly, eyes flicking to each corner of the property as he always did habit, not nerves. Everything looked still. The cattle were clustered near the western fence, heads low, tails swishing at flies. Nothing out of place, but something felt wrong. Not loud, just off, like a note in a familiar song played half a beat to. Soon, he killed the engine and stepped out, boots landing with a soft crunch on the gravel. The wind had dropped off entirely, leaving the air heavy and still. As he approached the barn, the first thing he noticed was the door, the east-facing one, It was opened by no more than 6 inches, a sliver of darkness between wood and frame. The lock hung loose on the outside, still snapped shut, but the latch bar had been lifted and set carefully against the siding, like someone hadn't wanted to break in just to be noticed. Jack stopped a few feet away, scanning the ground. There were no fresh boot prints in the dirt, no tire marks leading up to the barn itself. Whoever it was had been careful. Experienced, this wasn't kids looking for a thrill. This was something else. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, with the tip of his cane, and stepped inside. The barn was dim, the only light coming from a high window where a sunbeam split the dust in lazy spirals. The air was warm, thick with the smells of hay and old oil. At first glance, nothing had been disturbed. The tools were where he'd left them. Feed bags still stacked the workbench, untouched. But then he saw it near the center of the barn, hanging. From a rusted hook that hadn't held anything in years was a chicken, or rather what was left of one, headless. Its feathers matted with drying blood, the throat ragged where it had been cut, not torn, but sliced precise, surgical. The body hung limp, swinging slightly in the air-conditioned stillness. Jack stood, absolutely still. There was no note, no markings, no graffiti. Just the bird. It was a message, the kind that came without translation. He had seen variations of it in South America, in the Balkans, in outer provinces where law didn't stretch. Cartels didn't send warnings, they sent proofs. A mutilated animal was not just symbolism, was ritual, territory marking, a quiet demonstration that someone had been inside your walls and left untouched, that they could come again. He crouched beside the hook, careful not to disturb the blood pooled beneath it. There wasn't much, just a few dark drops already turning tacky. In the heat, he didn't touch the bird, didn't flinch. He simply stood, walked to the back of the barn, and checked the hidden room's door. Still locked, still sealed, he returned to the main space, eyes tracking slowly across the rafters and walls. No fingerprints to lift, no scent to follow. But he knew how to read what others overlooked. The latch outside reset deliberately. The rope used on the chicken barn stock, his own. Whoever did this hadn't brought it with them. They had used what they found. That meant time inside, comfort. That was the part that mattered. Jack took down the bird last, not with disgust, not with care, just detachment. He wrapped it in a feed sack, tied it closed, and carried it out past the barn into the edge of the field, where he buried it beneath a mesquite tree, 3 feet down, not for ritual, for containment. Then he returned to the house and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a spiral notebook with no markings, blank pages. He opened to the first one and wrote with slow, firm strokes, barn breach, night unknown, message left, presence felt, nitrogen monoxonates, sign of entry damage, message received. He closed the notebook, locked it, and returned it to its place. Outside, the sky began to turn orange at the edges. He didn't turn the porch light on that night. Let them try again in the dark. Jack didn't reach for the phone. He didn't dial the sheriff, didn't report the trespass, didn't file anything. There would have been a time for that, years ago, back when he still played the part of a man who believed in processes. But that time was long gone. He'd learned the hard way that there are kinds of trouble official channels can't contain, especially when that trouble doesn't leave fingerprints and doesn't wait for permission. Instead, after sunset, once the fields were quiet and the cattle had settled into their usual stillness, Jack returned to the barn. The door, now resecured, didn't creak when he opened it. He'd oiled the hinges earlier, quietly, almost reverently, the kind of maintenance done not for upkeep but for readiness. The sky outside was darkening fast, streaks of dull red fading into ash. He didn't bother with the overhead lights, just a single lantern, hooded, carried in one hand. Past the workbench, past the hooks where old tools hung, untouched since spring. The place smelled of dust and dried grain, but beneath that, something colder lingered, the kind of cold that came from steel buried deep beneath wood. He stopped near the southeast corner of the barn where a stack of feed sacks sat slumped. Against the wall, weathered burlap, a few patched with duct tape. Jack set the lantern down and began moving them one by one. Slowly, carefully, until the wood beneath was exposed to anyone else. It would have looked like a regular section of floral boards, scuffed in gray, stained with time. But Jack knew where to press. Near the edge, just beside a warped beam, he reached down and slipped his fingers beneath a small notch. The hatch lifted with a groan, not loud, but distinct. Beneath the wood was metal, dark and matte, reinforced with riveted steel platework. Reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a key, not the kind that opened doors in houses. This one was long, narrow, flat-cut. He slid it into the recessed lock on the hatch's frame, turned once, and felt the catch release. The hatch rose, heavier than it looked. Jack braced it open with a steel rod mounted in the wall. Below, a narrow set of steps descended into silence. He took the lantern and followed. The room beneath the barn wasn't wide, but it was built solid poured concrete walls, reinforced. Joints, insulated lining. No windows, no sounds from above. It had been constructed years ago, at a time when Jack didn't trust that the life he'd built could hold. It had no legal permits, no paper trail, but it had everything else he needed. Along one wall, an old filing cabinet stood sealed. Next to it, a table with a military-grade laptop sat dark, battery long removed. On the far side, crates ammo medical equipment wrapped in plastic sheeting, all sealed, all untouched, until now. Jack moved to the table. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a small box wrapped in a black cloth. Inside were items he hadn't seen in more than a decade. A listening device with a 30-meter range, a signal sniffer, a satellite phone partially disassembled. Tools, tiny and precise, organized in foam cutouts like surgical instruments. He didn't touch the weapons yet. That would come later. Tonight was about acknowledgement. They had stepped onto his land, they had entered his space and left a message in the language of fear. But they had done it. Without knowing who he was, Jack set the box down and walked to the corner, where an old trunk rested beneath a canvas tarp. He pulled the cover back and opened it, revealing two uniforms, one foreign, one American, both folded, both cleaned. Beneath them, a folder in a zip-sealed case marked with an old seal faint now, but visible under the lantern's flicker. He stared at it for a moment, then closed the trunk. The silence in the room held like breath before a storm. Jack Landry wasn't preparing for war. He was remembering how to be the man who had already survived one. The room beneath the barn was colder than the air above, even in the middle of a Texas summer. No breeze reached down here. No sun warmed the concrete. The walls were poured thick and smooth, lined with steel reinforcements that disappeared behind. Clean seams, it had been built for permanence, not comfort. Jack stepped down the last of the narrow stairs, the lantern casting long shadows ahead of him. The air smelled faintly of gun oil and old cement rye, metallic still. There were no windows, no vents that connected to the outside, no way for sound to carry through. That was intentional. Long ago, this room had been something simple, a place to trap animals, coyotes mostly, the kind that took chickens at night and vanished before sunrise. Jack had built it during his first year on the property, back when the land had still felt like something he had to prove he could tame. Back then, the space was crude, wire cages, bait buckets, and a drain in the floor for what came after. But things changed. Jack changed years later. After the coyotes became less of a problem and the world grew louder beyond his fence line, the room took on another purpose. He poured new walls, insulated them, soundproofed every inch, until the only noise that existed in this space was the one you brought with you. He reinforced the door with a triple latch locking mechanism and a biometric deadbolt system salvaged from an old facility overseas. Then he cleared the floor, stripped bare. There were no chairs now, no furniture at all, just two small recessed lights in the ceiling and a floor drain that still worked if needed. It was an empty space designed not to comfort, but to remove distractions. No clocks, no colors, just time, silence, and a mind left alone with itself. Jack stood in the middle of the room and let the quiet settle around him. He hadn't used the room in 15 years. Not since before he walked away, but he had maintained it all the same. Tested the seal, checked the locks, recalibrated the fingerprint scanner. Not because he expected to need it again, but because he knew better than to assume he wouldn't. Men like him didn't get to choose when the past would come knocking. They only got to decide how ready they were when it did. The walls didn't echo. The sound of his boots didn't carry. Even his breathing felt swallowed up in the concrete hush. He walked to the far end of the room and examined the wall panel, hidden flush behind a false seam. Pressed a small magnetic sensor to the spot. It clicked open, revealing a narrow supply. Cabinet syringes, gauze, a small cooler for temporary storage, and 2 sets of reinforced restraints, one with dried wear at the cuffs. He stared at them for a moment, then closed the panel again. The space was still clean, still ready. Jack stepped back to the center of the floor and stood there a while longer, not moving, not planning, just remembering. There had been rooms like this scattered across the globe, some smaller, some colder, all used for the same thing. Not interrogation, exactly not torture, something more specific. It was a place where men unraveled, where their ideas of control, of loyalty, of times lowly peeled away. He'd seen it 100 times, had helped make it happen more than he cared to admit. He wasn't proud of those years, but he didn't regret them either. He turned off the lantern and stood in total darkness. He counted the seconds it took for his eyes to adjust. Then he counted the seconds after that. Time moved differently here, slower, truer. He listened not for footsteps or sounds above, but for the part of himself he had kept sealed with this room. The part the agency had once trusted more than their own protocols. The part that didn't hesitate. Jack let that part breathe again. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just turned, climbed the stairs, and sealed the hatch behind him. Whatever came next, he would meet it down here. The safe house was an old adobe structure, its walls weathered by desert winds and sun-bleached into a pale rust color. It sat at the edge of a forgotten county road, 20 miles south of Jack Landry's property, hidden behind a stretch of thorn brush and the skeletal remains of a collapsed cattle fence. From the outside, it looked abandoned, half a roof, no mailbox, windows blacked out. But inside, the air buzzed with cigarette smoke, static from an old radio, and the smell of warmed tortillas on a hot plate. 3 men sat around a folding table, cluttered with paper maps, burner phones, and an open case of ammo still half sealed in shrink. They were young, none of them over 25, but they carried themselves with a kind of overconfidence that came from having moved up faster than they were ready for. Fast promotions were common in their world, so were fast funerals. The oldest of the 3 had a snake tattoo that coiled from his throat down to his collarbone. He smoked without looking up, eyes locked on a blurred satellite image of the surrounding ranchland. Beside him, Mateo tapped absently at a phone, logging coordinates into a messaging app that would delete the thread in 60 seconds. The third, Rico, leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankles, laughing at nothing in particular. "Just an old farmer," Rico said, grinning as he reached for a beer. 70, maybe more, lives alone. Runs a few cattle and mines. His own business. He won't even hear us come. Luis didn't smile. He flicked ash into an empty mug. "That's what they said about the last one." "Yeah," Rico shot back, "but that guy had a nephew in law enforcement. This old man, he's got nothing. No wife, no crew, nothing." Mateo looked up. "He's got cameras now." Luis nodded once, motioning. "Saw the feed yesterday, one on the barn, one watching the south fence. The third, we couldn't confirm, but it's there." "Who cares?" Rico shrugged. "We wear masks. We go in, leave a sign, get out. 2 minutes, no sound." Luis finally looked at him. "That's not what this is." Rico frowned, his bravado faltering just slightly. "Then what is it?" "It's a probe," Mateo answered, lowering the phone. "Boss wants to know if the route holds, if this guy gets scared, if he runs, or if he calls someone." Luis nodded again. "He's watching, so we let him watch. Let him wonder what's next, and if he doesn't react," Rico asked, sitting up straighter now, reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, thick with printed instructions. "Then we escalate. Step 2 is mapped. Step 3 depends on what we find in the house. Old men hide money or leverage," which Rico snorted. "Doesn't matter," Luis said. "Orders. Our orders, outside." The desert wind picked up, dragging a thin sheet of dust across the empty road. A hawk passed overhead, its shadow slicing the cracked earth for a moment before vanishing dot inside the safe house. Mateo spread out a second map. This one showed elevations, blind spots in the fencing paths, used by coyotes and mule teams. He tapped a point just east of a windmill. "That's where we come in. Tall grass. No line of sight from the house. He won't see us until we're halfway across the field, Luis pointed at the barn. "We leave the door open again, but this time we add pressure. Small break, visible, nothing serious." "And then?" Rico asked. "Then we wait." They sat in silence for a moment. Not out of fear, at least not the kind they'd admit, but out of calculation. In their world, everyone was a tool or a target, sometimes both. Jack Landry was supposed to be the former, but the truth was, they didn't know what kind of man lived in that house beyond the field. All they had was a grainy photo taken from a satellite feed and the word of a middleman who hadn't been there in person. They didn't know that the lockbox had been opened, that the cold room beneath the barn had been aired out, that the man they were watching had once waited in darker rooms than this, with no windows, no food, and no belief in mercy. They didn't know yet, but they would. For the first time in years, Jack's morning didn't begin with coffee. Not right away. The percolator sat cold on the counter while he walked the perimeter of his land with a quiet focus that had nothing to do with livestock. The air was dry and already warming. He wore gloves, though there was no frost, and a long-sleeved shirt that concealed the slow work of muscle still under his age. He began with sand from an old stack of feed bags. He cut 3 open and poured their contents in long, thin strips. Across the dirt just inside the eastern and southern fence lines, not enough to look unnatural, just enough to register movement. A footprint in dry soil was easy to miss in wind or rain, but a footprint in a controlled layer of sand that stayed, and Jack needed to know who came and when. At the barn entrance, he laid a finer layer, smoother than the rest. It would tell him more how long they stood, which direction they turned, whether they paused. He placed a thin metal rod horizontally behind the top beam of the barn door, fixed with a pressure switch from his old gear cache, not to cause harm, just to make noise, enough to alert him from inside the house. Next came the cameras. They weren't store-bought anymore. He'd replaced those with thermal sensors, old surplus, low race, but reliable. He mounted one high in the pecan tree near the watering trench, another inside the loft hatch on the barn's west end. They had limited battery life, but Jack wouldn't need more than 72 hours. If no movement came in that window, he'd recalibrate.in. The meantime, he sharpened the garden shears. They looked rusted, the kind that hadn't touched soil in a season, but their edge, once cleaned and run against stone, still sliced paper without hesitation. Jack wrapped the grip in rubber tape and placed them under the back steps beside the well pump. Not for show, not for gardening, for reach, for silence. He adjusted his sleeping arrangements next. The bed remained untouched in the main house, just as it had always been, but he wouldn't be using it. He cleared space in the laundry room, dragging in a cot with a wool blanket and one narrow pillow. From there, he had a direct line of sight through the narrow hallway to the front door, and from a small crawl vent, he could observe the rear. He also retrieved the dog bowls. Shadow had been gone 5 years, but Jack never threw them out. He placed one just inside the kitchen entrance, half filled with water. A visual trick meant to imply the presence of something that still patrolled the grounds. He'd used tactics like this before in war zones, where an extra shadow in a window could delay an ambush. Sometimes suggestion worked better than forced dot. Dusk, Jack wired a motion light to the tool shed and left the outer door unlatched just enough to sway. If they returned, they'd approach it. Most intruders couldn't resist what looked like a mistake. He didn't eat much that first night. Toast and canned meat, eaten cold. No lights on in the house, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of wood settling under desert air. He moved slowly, precisely. Each drawer opened and shut with intention. Each item placed not just for use, but for message. This wasn't paranoia. This was communication. He'd once taught recruits how to read a battlefield. From objects, a lone cigarette butts in a circle, one facing outward meant a lookout. Cooking pots recently blackened meant fast departure. People left fingerprints in how they prepared, and now Jack was preparing in return. By the end of the 3rd day, the land looked unchanged, but it wasn't, and neither was he. The sound of tires on gravel was slow, deliberate, not the impatient crunch of a delivery truck or the careless spin of tourists passing through. Jack looked up from his workbench as the dust rose near the gate. He wiped his hands on a cloth set the pliers down beside a spool of copper wire, and walked to the porch without saying anything. The truck was familiar. Older model Ford, sun-faded red, patches of primer showing through where the paint had long since surrendered. It pulled to a stop, engine idling for a beat before cutting out. The door opened with a rusty creak, and a man stepped down tall, still lean despite the years. Wearing worn jeans and a shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow. His gait was even quiet, shoes on old boots. Harold Jenkins didn't speak at first. He just nodded, held up the aluminum tin in one hand like a peace offering, and started walking up the path. Jack stepped down to meet him. No handshake, just a shared glance, long enough to scan each other for the usual signs. Weight loss, slack jaw, tremor. Harold's eyes flicked once to the new locks on the barn, then to the trail cam half concealed in the fence post. Brought blackberry, he said finally, holding out the pie. Jack took it. Appreciate it, Harold sniffed. Darla's recipe? Found the card last week behind the coffee grinder. Jack cracked the smallest smile. She always did double the sugar. Harold shrugged. Keeps the bitterness down. They stood for a while like that, the way old soldiers do when words don't carry as much weight as silence. Behind them, the wind rustled the dry grass. A hawk circled over the west field, dipping low, then rising again. You still keeping goats? Jack asked, more out of rhythm than interest. Traded coyotes, got smart. Figured it wasn't. Worth the fight, Jack nodded. Smart. Harold's gaze drifted again to the sand, laid near the edge of the porch, the glint of wiring tucked under the eaves. But he didn't ask, didn't question the new pattern. He just exhaled slow and deep through his nose, as if cataloging something for later. I'll let you get back to whatever this is. Appreciate the pie, Jack said again, holding it under one arm. Harold nodded. You know where I am. The engine coughed back to life after a few tries, and the truck rolled away in a wide arc, trailing dust behind it as it returned to the county road. Jack didn't watch it leave for long, just long enough to see that Harold didn't take the main route home. He turned onto the gravel path that led behind the ridge, where the old observation posts used to be. By the time Harold reached his house 2 miles and a fence line later, he didn't go straight inside. He walked past the porch, past the propane tank, and into the back shed. The door was stiff, warped from years of heat. He had to put his shoulder into it. Inside, the dust was thicker. It clung to the rafters and hung in shafts of late afternoon light. He stepped over an old box fan and reached for the attic pull-dash string. The ladder groaned beneath his weight. He didn't need a flashlight. He'd walked this space in the dark before, reached behind the third support beam beneath a tarp, and pulled out a long canvas duffel. He laid it flat on the floor, unzipped it, and checked each item one by one. Old habits, a coil of wire, a two-way radio, field dressing still sealed in its foil pouch, and a Beretta M9, cleaned, oiled, and unfired since 2003. Harold zipped the bag shut and set it beside the attic door. He didn't need to ask what was coming. He'd already been told by the new locks, the sand. And Jack's hands not quite resting when they stood on the porch. There were some men you didn't talk. Out of readiness, you just made sure they weren't standing alone when the storm came. The clock on the kitchen wall clicked softly toward midnight, the second hand stuttering between the marks. Outside, the wind had gone still, leaving the dry air heavy and waiting. Jack sat in the dark, his chair turned slightly toward the window, where the yard beyond was lit by nothing but moonlight, and the faint outline of shadows stretching long across the ground. The house made its usual night noises, wood creaking, the hum of the fridge, a faint ticking from the wall heater's pilot light. He had memorized these sounds over the years. They were background to a life of quiet repetition. But when the refrigerator's hum died and the heater's click fell silent, he noticed it instantly. The power cut was abrupt. Clean, no flicker, no warning, just darkness. Jack didn't move for a few seconds, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The house was quiet, now too quiet. He reached down, opened the drawer next to him, and took out a small hand-cranked lantern. A few turns of the lever, and it came alive with a low amber glow, casting shadows across the walls. The light was soft, but steady. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a box marked Tools. Inside was the 12-gauge shotgun, its blued steel barrel still intact. though the stock was scratched from years of storage and transport. He wiped it down with an old rag and broke it open. 2 shells slid in smoothly. Buckshot. Not for warning, he closed it with a quiet snap. Not a sound of panic, but one of routine. The back of the house held a small terminal by hardline to the thermal cams. It ran independently of the power grid, battery-backed for 48 hours. Jack tapped the screen, and 3 live feeds flickered into view. The feed from the pecan tree came up first. Clear, no movement. Just a faint breeze shifting the branches. The one from the west loft was next, still functional, still steady. The third was black dot, no signal. He looked at the timestamp. It had gone dark just 4 minutes ago, right after the power flicked out. He stood without haste and crossed to the coat rack. He didn't put on a jacket, just slipped a utility belt over his shirt to pouches. 1 knife, 1 flashlight with a red filter. The lantern stayed on the table. He didn't want light behind him. Outside, the air was cool against his face. Dry grass whispered underfoot as he moved past the porch steps, his boots pressing gently into the sand he had laid earlier. He paused, shining the red beam along the trail. Nothing disturbed. He reached the barn and saw it immediately. The door was shut, same as always, but the light above it was flickering in odd rhythm, not broken, just tampered. Wires pulled halfway from the sensor. A quick job, not done cleanly. Jack kept to the left side, staying low near the wall. He reached into the corner near the hayshed and retrieved the extra trail cam he'd mounted. At waist height, concealed in an old feed bin, it was still working. He pulled the micro SD card, slipped it into the portable reader, and checked the last few minutes of footage. Movement, a shape. 1 man, thin, wearing a mask, had approached the barn door and cut the cable with a small blade. The figure had hesitated, looking toward the house, then moved off-screen toward the south fence. No attempt to enter, just a message. Jack stood silently, the shotgun still balanced in his hand. He didn't follow the direction the figure had gone. He didn't shout or fire a warning. That wasn't his way. He walked slowly back to the house, checked the sand again, nothing fresh, and stepped inside. The power had come back, lights blinking on 1 by 1, but he didn't flip a switch. He sat back down in the same chair, shotgun resting across his knees, lantern still casting its warm, steady glow. They had tested the system. Just a flicker, just a blackout, just enough to see how he would react. He had. Now they knew he was awake. What they didn't know yet, what they hadn't calculated, was that Jack Landry never reacted. He prepared. The digital clock by Jack's cot glowed faintly in the dark. 2:12 a.m. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of the wall unit, still powered, still steady. Outside, the night held its breath. No coyotes howled. No wind stirred the grass, just a dense, heavy stillness, as if the land itself was listening. He was already awake. Jack had been resting, not sleeping. His boots were still on. The shotgun lay across the cot beside him, loaded, safety off. His hand hovered just above it, not gripping yet, just waiting. There was no dramatic sound, no door kicked in, no alarms. But Jack knew. He always had a sense for timing. The quiet had shifted. Then came the sound, faint, like a boot scuff against wood, far off toward the barn. Then another. Then silence. Again, he moved without hesitation. From the cot to the floor, low and smooth, he pulled the lantern cord once and turned the red filter on. The dim glow lit the hallway just enough to move. He didn't go for the front door. Instead, he opened the back pantry and slipped into the crawlspace entrance behind the water heater. It gave him a view through the kitchen vent directly across the yard to the barn. He heard the click of metal before he saw them. The bolt cutter snapped quietly. Once, twice, not on the barn, but on the southern gate. He caught the shimmer of one man's blade, a machete, held low as he crept forward, boots brushing against the fence post. Another figure knelt by the lock on the shed, examining it with a small flashlight, quickly twisting it away with a quiet grunt. The third walked in measured steps behind them, holding a small handheld radio. He raised it to his mouth once, spoke low in Spanish. No reply. He waited, spoke again. Still nothing. Jack recognized the rhythm, a field check-in. Routine comes. He wasn't just signaling his team, he was confirming his own safety. The silence was its own answer. They entered the barn one by one. The first stepped inside fast, scanning with a flashlight. Unaware, it was backlit by Jack's hidden thermal lens mounted above the rafters. The second man followed slower, machete drawn, watching angles like someone with training. The third hung back, radio still in hand. Scanning for movement, Jack didn't need to stop them yet. Instead, he moved out from the crawl space, low along the east fence line where the shadows were thicker. The shotgun was slung across his chest, now replaced in his hands by something quieter, an old flare gun modified for flashbang rounds. He had two loaded, not lethal, not necessary. He waited until all three were in the barn. Then he aimed for the inside wall and fired. The burst lit up the barn in a white flash, followed by a concussive pop that disoriented more than it injured. Through the open door, he saw the Chaos One man dropped his flashlight, the beam spinning across the floor, blinding the second as he lunged forward. The machete hit a metal support beam and clattered to the ground. The man with the radio tried, again, to signal. Still nothing. Jack was already at the doorway, shotgun raised. But he didn't enter. He simply called out, voice low but sharp. Step out, one at a time, hands visible. You've got 3 seconds. They didn't respond. He waited 2, then chambered around with a loud, deliberate click, stumbling into the open with his hands raised halfway, muttering something Jack didn't answer. He kicked the machete toward the barn door. The second followed, moving slower, eyes squinting against the dark. No weapon but his stance said he'd run if given the window. The third stayed hidden, still gripping the radio, still waiting. Jack leveled the shotgun toward the rafters and fired one spear intimidation. The echo bounced across the field and into the distance. The last man stepped out, hands up, the radio swinging loosely from a strap around his wrist. Jack didn't speak. He just stood there, shotgun steady, watching them breathe. They weren't. From here, their eyes darted too fast. Their boots were clean. Their formation was wrong for someone who knew the land. But more than anything, more than the weapons, the planning or the timing, what confirmed it for Jack was simple. Know what silence really meant? Not yet. The night had returned to silence, but it was not peace. The air carried tension, sharp and coiled. Jack stood with his shotgun angled low. The 3 intruders gathered near the barn wall under the muted light of a lantern he'd hung from a hook. He hadn't tied them. Not yet. Their fear was leash enough. Eyes darting, chests rising too fast, legs twitching as if debating whether to bolt. Jack knew that kind of panic, the kind that makes people clumsy. He let the silence stretch. Then he spoke, moved to the fence. South side, they didn't answer, just shifted nervously, eyes flicking toward each other for some sign of leadership. But their leader hadn't answered the radio. Their orders were stale now. Jack nodded once. Go. They moved slowly, as if still deciding whether this was a trick. It wasn't. Not yet. Jack kept a few steps behind, boots deliberate in the dirt. When they reached the stretch of field near the south fence, the first man, a tall one with a nervous gait and red cloth around his neck, broke formation. He turned his head, squinting into the dark toward the thicket near the irrigation ditch. He bolted, didn't wait for orders, didn't check footing, just ran like a man whose thoughts had cracked through the surface. The others shouted Spanish curses, warnings, but it was too late. There was a faint thunk, then the dull, fleshy sound of weight meeting steel. The scream that followed was not sharp hit, was low, guttural, rising from the stomach like something being torn open from the inside. Jack didn't flinch. The man had dropped into a shallow pit, no more than 5 feet deep, camouflaged with dry grass and loose plywood. Inside were old lengths of rusted rebar broken fence rods hammered into the ground at random angles, uneven and cruel. One had pierced the man's thigh clean through. Another had caught his side. He writhed, trying to lift himself, but the rebar bent beneath him. Blood soaked the dirt in thick patches. The second man froze, torn between helping and running. Jack watched his indecision. It snapped the moment the wounded man let out another scream. The second man ran full sprint, not toward the barn, not toward his downed friend, but east, toward the edge of the fence where the land dropped into a dry wash. He never saw the cable. Jack had strung it 3 days earlier. Chest height for most men, throat height for someone running fast and blind. tensioned between two fence posts wrapped in dark cloth to blend into the shadows. It was steel cord. Not enough to kill, but more than enough to stop. The runner hit it full force. It caught under his chin and lifted him off his feet before gravity reclaimed him. He landed flat, coughing hard, hands clutching his neck. The impact hadn't broken skin, but his breath came in hoarse gasps and his balance was gone. He tried to stand, stumbled sideways, then stayed down. The third man didn't move. He stood alone now, still clutching the useless radio, his face drawn tight and pale under the dim light. He didn't run, didn't speak, just stared at Jack like he was seeing something he didn't understand, and maybe never had. Jack lowered the shotgun just slightly, not as a sign of peace, just recalibrating. "Pick up your friend," he said quietly. "Leave the others." The man hesitated. Jack stepped closer, voice even. "You've got 30 seconds, no more." The man moved, not fast, not brave, just enough to get it done. He lifted the gasping one under the shoulder, dragging him backward toward the fence, leaving the screaming one behind. The cries from the pit had softened now, more sob than scream, blood turning sticky in the dirt. They disappeared into the night, dragging each other, coughing, stumbling. Jack didn't follow. He walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. The man inside was still conscious. Barely, his hand reached up, shaking. Jack stared for a long moment, then turned off the lantern and walked away. The night was heavy now. The adrenaline had drained from the soil, leaving behind only breath and blood. Jack stood a few paces from the edge of the pit, where the injured man lay unmoving, pinned on rusted metal. His leg trembled with every shallow breath. The cries had stopped not because the pain had, but because it had found a new depth, one beyond sound. Jack knew that threshold well. He didn't crouch, didn't lean over like a rescuer. He stood tall, in shadow, the shotgun slung behind him. He didn't need it anymore. From the dark, his voice emerged, not loud, not threatening. Calm, precise, measured. "Sabis kwayansoi?" he asked softly. The man in the pit shifted, barely able to move his head. His mouth opened, but made no sound. Jack stepped 1 inch closer. No light, no flashlight, just his figure, a darker shade of black in the moonless night. "Dime," he said again. "Porchway, Venust Acqui. No heirs, el primero, en intentarlo. No Sarahs, el ultimo." The man's eyes flicked upward. He recognized something now. Not the face, not the name, but the tone. Jack had spoken with that tone before. In rooms where the only clock was the heartbeat of the man across the table. Rooms without windows. Rooms where truth had a cost. The silence stretched. Jack let it, then he spoke again. Same calm rhythm. "You were told this land was easy, that the man living here was old, alone, tired." He paused, then in English, "But nobody asked what I did before cows." The man swallowed hard. His throat clicked dryly. He finally managed one word. We were told. Nobody would be here, just fences." Jack nodded, though the gesture went unseen. "And you believed them?" He walked a slow circle around the pit. Gravel shifted beneath his boots. The sound was deliberate. Measured, "I've heard 100 stories like yours. Poor crudes recruited young, promised reward. Told to scare a farmer, told it's just one night." The man in the pit exhaled painfully. His lips trembled. "We didn't mean to kill, just scare, send a message." "You sent one," Jack said plainly. "With the chicken, with the power, with the bolt cutters." He stopped walking. "And now I'm sending one back." A long pause. Then Jack crouched, not close, but enough to lower his voice to something that felt like breath against skin. "I used to ask questions. In other countries, before your time, I was trained not to shout, not to beat, but to listen, to silence. That's how I knew when someone was lying." He waited. The man's breathing stuttered. "Why are you here?" The man's voice came slower now. The pain was weakening him. "They said this route, old trail, less patrols. We come through once, test it. If it works, we bring more. Not just us." Jack stood again. "Who's we?" A flicker of fear crossed the man's eyes. Even through pain, there were things worse than bleeding in a pit. Jack saw it. "You know the name," he said. "Say it." The man looked away. Jack didn't press, not yet. Instead, he stepped back into shadow, his voice fading as he moved. "Sleep if you can," he said, now in Spanish again. "But if I were you, I'd use this time to think about how much you're willing to lose." He paused. "You'll still be alive come morning. That's more than most." Then Jack was gone. No sound, no footsteps, just wind returning to the grass and the steady hum of a land that had learned to keep secrets. The cold room beneath the barn hadn't changed in decades. Cinder block walls, poured concrete floor, no windows, no sound, just a drain in the center and a single overhead bulb dimmed to the edge of flicker. Jack sat in the corner, out of view. At first, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let the room do the work. The captured scout was seated on a metal chair bolted to the floor, wrists loosely restrained, not tight, not cruel, just enough. His jacket had been removed and placed neatly on a wooden bench against the far wall. His eyes flicked around the space, then to the door, then back to the drain. He didn't speak. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the chill. The temperature sat around 48 degrees low, enough to dull the senses, high enough to drag out time. The silence pressed in like weight. Jack remained in shadow, seated just behind the beam where the light didn't quite reach. A camera mounted in the corner blinked once, silently. The scout exhaled, long and sharp. His breathing was uneven, shallow. Every 30 seconds he looked up, expecting someone to enter. No one did. He shifted in his seat, winced as his leg of fresh wound from the pit throbbed with pressure. Jack had wrapped it, but not spoken. No explanation, no threats. Just the quiet handling of a man who'd done it before. After the first hour, the scout tried to talk. "Hey," he called in Spanish, voice shaking. "Who are you?" No answer. "I got nothing to do with this. I just follow what they say. I didn't choose it." Still nothing. He strained against the cuffs knot to break free, but to confirm they held, they did. Loose, but unforgiving. "You want money?" he asked. "We got money. I can make a call." "I can," his voice cracked. Jack shifted slightly, just enough for the scout to catch the silhouette. The man froze. Recognition wasn't clear, yet tonally presence. Something older. He stopped talking. The hours ticked. No sound except for the slight hum of the bulb and the distant creak of the barn settling above. Jack leaned back slightly, arms folded, watching every twitch, every breath, every blink. He wasn't analyzing, he was waiting. The scout's fear wasn't loud. It was slow, grinding, the kind that crawls in when time stops cooperating. Around hour 3, the scout mumbled something under his breath, prayer or confession, maybe both. His head hung lower. Now, his fingers tapped nervously against the seat. He wasn't cold yet, but the edges of his mind were starting to fray. Jack could see it in the mouth, how it stayed slightly open now, no longer clenched. The scout looked up again. "I know who you are," he said finally. His voice was hoarse. "They said you were dead." Jack didn't respond. "They called you." Kilo Echo," he muttered. "In Sonora. Years ago, rumors. CIA ghost. Still nothing." The scout swallowed hard. "I didn't believe them. They said, you made people forget who they were." Jack stood, quietly. The scout's eyes locked onto the shape, terrified, no not, of what would happen, but what wouldn't. The absence of noise, the stillness of it. Jack stepped into the faint light, finally revealing his face. The scar below his eye caught the glow for a moment. He didn't speak. He simply dragged a metal stool from the sidewall, its legs scratching softly against the floor. He placed it 5 feet from the scout, then sat, arms crossed. They stared at each other, one silent, one unraveling, and Jack waited, because he knew when fear had no target, it turned inward. And in this room, that was all it needed to do. South of the border, protocols don't wait for emotion. At the safe house in Coahuila, a concrete room behind a weathered mechanic's garage served as the command point for a mid-tier smuggling wing of the Loma Verde cartel. Buzzed not with tension, but with structure. This wasn't the part of the organization that made loud threats or filmed chaotic messages. This was the quieter layer, and it moved fast when silence became suspicious. 3 men sat around a fold-out table, each with calloused fingers and dry eyes that hadn't blinked much in years. One tapped at a battered satellite phone. Another leafed through a list of confirmed checkpoints and planned crossings. The third, older than the others, and wearing a pressed white guayabera shirt, leaned back in a plastic chair with arms crossed. They were due back 6 hours ago. One said. 7, corrected the man with the guayabera, and the radio went dead before that. They didn't speak the names of the missing scouts. Not out of respect, out of design. Cartel logistics, especially in rural smuggling corridors, relied on expendable pairs. If one team failed, a second team didn't pause to ask why. They came to clean, recover, assess, and report, then leave quickly. Activate Bravo Delta. Quiet unit, no phones, no locals. 2 men. The younger one tapped the phone again, encrypting a short burst message into a military-style format. GPS coordinates, target zone, expected condition, compromised. In a separate garage 2 towns over, 2 men had already been halfway through a nap when the message arrived. They didn't groan, they didn't hesitate. Both moved as if they'd been expecting it. One zipped his vest closed, the other checked a field kit containing surgical gloves, wire ties to phones with wiped caches, and a black duffel sealed with duct tape. They didn't carry machetes or radios or insignias. They carried cameras, and one shoveled by midnight. They were already on the road north in a gray pickup with forged agricultural plates. No decals, no stickers, nothing to suggest cartel be. Because that wasn't the point. They weren't soldiers. They were function. Back at the command table, the man in the guayabera reviewed the printed satellite image of the crossing route. Narrow zone with few structures. 1 barn, several outbuildings, some fence line. The target area had been used before. Decades earlier, when mule trains still ran grain and diesel, it was quiet territory. No patrol towers, no drones. Until now, what do we expect? One of the younger men asked. The guayabera shrugged. Could be local vigilantes, or someone misread the map. Could be border patrol. No, too far, in, and too quiet. If they found a cell, they'd call it in. This is different. He looked again at the last ping from the missing team. To 13 a.m., then nothing. No final words, no call for backup, not even static. He tapped a spot on the imageware. The fence curved near a dry canal. This is where they crossed. The others nodded. Send instructions. If they find nothing, they don't linger. If they find bodies, they don't bury them. We need evidence. We need a pattern. And if it's a trap, the guayabera leaned forward slowly. Then we finally know what we're dealing with. The cleaner team was 2 hours from the property line. They would not knock, they would not speak. And if they found resistance, their protocol was not to retreat, it was to end the story. Quietly. The sun had barely cleared the tops of the mesquites when the dust trail curled up behind the government-issued SUV. It wasn't the usual visitor pattern. Jack hadn't seen a vehicle approach from the main road in weeks, and no local neighbor drove a black SUV with a narrow antenna. He knew the silhouette before it even parked by the fence. His son stepped out, clean-shaven in that way agents tended to be when they weren't in the field. Crisp khakis, steel-toed boots, a windbreaker zipped halfway up. Sunglasses hung from the collar, not worn. Jack stayed by the trough, pretending to refill the water line, but his eyes didn't leave the vehicle. The younger Landry didn't speak at first, just looked around, eyes scanning the barn, the fencing, the house. Then the boots crunched over dry earth as he walked closer. "You didn't answer my last call," he said flatly. Jack straightened slowly, didn't recognize the number. Figured it was some scam outfit selling irrigation supplies. His son didn't smile. "Mind if I take a walk?" he asked, already starting to move toward the barn before getting permission. Jack followed at a pace just slow enough to make a point dot inside the barn. The son paused. He looked around. The floor was swept to clean. New locks had been fitted to the feed room door. A heavy-duty cable now ran through the back window, frame freshly installed, not rusted like the rest. There was the faint scent of oil and powder, the kind only noticeable to people who'd spent time in firing ranges or evidence rooms. He crouched by the corner and touched the floor. Sand had been laid there recently, still dry, still coarse, used for tracking footprints. "Expecting animals?" he asked. "Just tightening up," Jack replied. "Coyotes keep sniffing around the barn. Figured I'd make it harder." The son stood, walked slowly toward a wall where an old Winchester used to hang. It was gone. In its place, the bracket was freshly polished as if something had recently been removed. "You know what I do, Dad," he said. Jack crossed his arms. "Yeah, you shuffle papers and drive a government car. I analyze border movement, intercepts, field chatter. I know when something's changed." He turned to face his father fully now. "They're probing. Small teams, testing routes. Last week, a rancher got shot near Sierra Blanca. Another one had a barn torched right in the middle of a corridor they've been talking about." Jack didn't answer. "You'd tell me if something felt off, wouldn't you?" the son asked, voice low now. Jack met his gaze. "There's nothing to tell, just cows and fence repairs." The son nodded once, slowly, then looked away. "All right," he said. He walked back to the SUV, pausing once to look out over the field behind the house, the one with the irrigation trench and the steel posts. He opened the back hatch, took a drink from a plastic bottle, and stood quietly. For a moment, then, without comment, he reached under the rear cargo mat, pulled out a black box the size of a matchbook, and palmed it. When Jack approached to say goodbye, the son reached for a hug. It was awkward stiff arms, no warmth. But, during it, he slid the small box beneath the lip of Jack's belt-mounted flashlight holder. Not inside the pocket, just behind the stitching dot Jack didn't notice, or he pretended not to. The son got in the vehicle, started the engine, and didn't look back. Inside the SUV, the tracker signal lit up on his console. No alert would trigger unless the beacon crossed a certain boundary in internal geofence. He programmed himself. It wasn't surveillance. He told himself it was insurance, just in case, because Jack was lying, and he was too good at it. The moon was high but hazy, diffused through thin clouds like a film stretched across the sky. It cast just enough light to outline the terrain, but not enough to reveal what waited in the gaps. Two trucks approached from the southwest this time, moving without headlights, diesel engines low, nearly crawling across the ridgeline beyond the irrigation canal. They took a different route than the first crew, carefully avoiding the tracks previously used. This team was methodical, experienced. Each man had night vision, plate carriers, military-grade suppressed rifles, and communications gear that hummed on encrypted frequencies. 6 men in total, split between the two vehicles. They didn't speak once after leaving the staging site. In Mexico, each knew the layout: barn on the east side, livestock paddocks to the north, windmill in the rear, and a dirt trail leading to a one-story farmhouse. They had studied the terrain from drone footage 2 days prior. Intel said the place belonged to an old man, possibly retired military, possibly just paranoid. Their objective was to identify threats, recover any fallen operatives, and render the location unusable. At 2:07 a.m., the truck stopped 300 yards out, engines off. The men dismounted, moving in a tight formation, fanning out toward the fence line. 2 carried breaching tools. One had a drone folded in his pack. Another carried a thermal scope. They moved like a disciplined unit, not cartel kids, with bravado and machetes. These were hired enforcers, possibly ex-police, possibly worse. They reached the fence without triggering anything. The sand near the gate had been brushed clean against something they noted with quiet professionalism. No footprints, no drag marks. They moved low, scanning the shadows, watching for glint or movement. The leader raised 2 fingers. 2 men veered right toward the barn. The others stayed close, covering their movement. But something was off. One of the men near the barn slowed, hand raised. A wire stretched knee-height, thin as fishing line, glinting briefly under infrared. He motioned, they clipped it, stepped over, resumed the advance. They reached the barn door. No lights, no movement, door slightly ajar. The leader tapped twice. On comes a low pop cracked through the quiet. One of the men at the rear dropped, clawing at his leg, screaming. Something sharp had launched from the underbrush, a spike or nail straight through his calf. Blood spilled dark into the dirt. The team dropped to a knee, scanning everywhere. Another noise metal scraping, then silence. The man by the door kicked it open. Darkness, stillness. They entered. Inside, the beam from a thermal scope swept the rafters. Nothing, but the temperature was lower than expected, even for night. No livestock, no tools, just shadows. Then a low click beneath one of the floorboards. The man standing closest went rigid. His boot had depressed something. A thin mist sprayed from beneath the floor, scentless and fast. He stumbled back, coughing violently. His eyes watered, breathing constricted. "Gas," one shouted, dragging him toward the door. But it wasn't lethal, just a mix designed to disorient and flush. Industrial ammonia and capsaicin. Homemade, but efficient. Their goggles fogged, throats burned. Orders fell into chaos. That's when the lights snapped on, not overhead, just for floodlights, angled from outside the barn, pinning every man inside in a harsh white silhouette. Then the voice, "I told the last ones not to come back." Calm, sharp, not shouting. The men froze, rifles raised, blinking into the brightness. The door slammed behind them. Bolted from the outside, one fired a round out of panic, but it hit nothing but wood. Outside, footsteps moved quickly, not running, not hiding. Inside, coughing and silence. Then, from the roof above, something dropped with a thud. A speaker, Jack's. Voice again, second wave. "You brought better shoes, shame you didn't bring better ears." Then static dot, and all the lights cut at once. The flames were supposed to rise fast. That was the plan. After all else failed, the fallback was fire. Not subtle, not smart, but effective. It left nothing behind. No tools, no cameras, no message from the old man who somehow predicted their every move. One of the enforcers slid a jerry can from the truck bed, still coughing from the earlier gas trap, but moving with a sense of desperation. His partner worked to pry the rear barn door loose, their earlier path now sealed from the outside. No clear exit, no backup. Radio comes silent. It was time to erase the scene. They doused the wooden siding starting from the southeast corner. Another soaked the cracks in the floorboards. Fuel soaked in with ease. The barn was dry from heat, the old cedar thirsty. In the center of the floor sat a rusted tank, wide and round, stamped with faded flammable warnings in Spanish. They assumed it was an old diesel drum. No one stopped to question why it wasn't stored near the tractors or why the dust around it had been recently cleared. One man lit a rag stuffed into a wine bottle. A makeshift Molotov crude, but they'd used worse. He nodded once, raised it. A soft click came from underfoot. Then came the hiss, a sound like steam from an angry kettle, followed by an unnatural bloom of dense white fog exploding from the center of the barn. It wasn't fire. It wasn't smoke. It was tear gas pressurized and modified with resin to stick to clothing, skin, and the inside of throats. Not military grade, but viciously effective in close quarters. Within seconds, visibility dropped to nothing. The enforcers panicked, eyes burned, lungs seized. Movement became disoriented. Chaos. They fumbled for their goggles, their weapons, their bearings. One kicked over the gas can, slipping in the spill. Another tried to fire through the haze, but his shots punched useless holes through the back wall in the blur. One thought he saw a figure pass near the far corner, silent, not coughing. Just watching, a voice emerged from the mist. Calm, not raised. You lit the match without knowing what room you were in. They fired toward the sound. Nothing. Then again closer, now behind them. You brought fire to a barn, thinking you'd be the ones to walk away. Another voice, another location. You didn't ask why this barn has no hay, why there's no livestock anymore. One of the men staggered toward the door, only to find it chained. He pulled at it, frantic, only to realize the chain ran through the ground itself, reinforced, anchored. Footsteps moved in circles, slowly, never fast enough to track, then stopped. A loud bang echoed from above the loft. They aimed upward, coughing, eyes red. A rope dropped, then something else. A body, not alive. It was one of the scouts from the earlier wavebound, unconscious, dumped like cargo into their midst. One of the enforcers vomited from the gas, staggering backward into a support beam. Another pulled out a knife and began slicing the rope, not to free the scout, but to repurpose it to anything to get out. Jack's voice cut through again. I was a ghost before your crew learned how to hold a rifle. I don't need to hurt you to stop you. I just need you to understand. He let the silence stretch. One man reached into his vest for a secondary. Phone 1 with a distress beacon. It was gone, removed, slipped from his gear, sometime in the last 10 minutes. The last thing they heard before the lights returned was the clang of a trapdoor ceiling shut beneath the barn. Not where Jack had entered, but where he'd left. The barn didn't burn. It didn't need to. He ran with blood in his boot, one leg dragging behind the other from a piece of rebar that had caught him at the thigh. Every breath burned as if the gas still clung to the lining of his throat, and the dry Texas air didn't help. His night vision goggles had been lost in the chaos inside the barn, and now the desert looked like a blur of shadows in motion. Coyotes barked somewhere in the distance, and every cactus, every mesquite stump looked like someone watching him. He kept running. Behind him, just minutes before, Jack had closed the steel hatch beneath the trapdoor and locked it from the inside. The man he'd pulled from the barn, older than the last scout, maybe mid-30s, stockier build, lay bound in the concrete room, wrists zip-tied behind his back. Jack hadn't said a word, just placed a bottle of water in the corner and shut the heavy door, leaving a single red bulb burning overhead. No noise, no sound, just time. The other one, the third, had slipped through the fog, crashing through the far fence line, adrenaline overriding pain. He hadn't seen where the others went, didn't know if they were dead or captured. All he knew was that something had gone very wrong, and that the man in the barn wasn't what they were told. Not a rancher, not a recluse, something else, something trained. He stumbled toward the highway, cutting through a dry riverbed and finally collapsing near a cattle guard a few miles from the main road. He dialed the satellite number 1 reserved for emergencies. His fingers were shaking, blood slicking the buttons. A man answered on the second ring, calm, deep-voiced. Status. The scout couldn't breathe right. His words came between gasps. Gone. It's all gone. They're not responding. I don't know where they are. I think he took them. Who, the old man? Silence. He's not just a farmer. He moved like someone who's done this before, like he was trained. He didn't yell. He didn't shoot. He just watched. Still silence on the other end. I think he was waiting for us. The scout winced, lifting his shirt. A clean slice ran from his ribs to his hip, shallow but burning. He didn't remember when it happened. He asked me questions. In Spanish, but not like normal, not like he was learning anything. He already knew. He just wanted to see how I'd lie. The voice on the line shifted slightly. What did he ask? Names, routes, our fallback positions. Not if I knew them. He already said them out loud, like he had a list. The scout looked up at the stars. They seemed to quiet tonight. I think he's done this before. I think we walked into a test we already failed. The man on the other end let the silence stretch again, then finally spoke. Send coordinates. We'll extract and shut down that route. What about the others? The scout asked. There was no answer. He lowered the phone, hand trembling. Somewhere in the dark, he thought he saw movement, just a shift in the horizon. But it didn't. Come closer, back beneath the barn, the new captive sat still, eyes wide, watching the door that hadn't opened again. He had already spoken once, unprompted, whispering names into the dark, like confessions. Jack hadn't even entered the room. He didn't need to. The third man's escape had been expected, not a failure. Sometimes, Jack knew, letting one go carried the loudest message. In the classified archives of Langley, not every file glows on screens. Some remain buried, paper only, stored in temperature-controlled vaults that haven't been touched in years. Jack Landry's was one of them. File 741K, e-tagged in red ink with the operational code Kilo Echo. For 17 years, the file sat dormant, sealed after voluntary separation and full retirement from field status. The contents weren't entirely redacted, but access required 3 levels of clearance. Not because of notoriety, but because of the kind of work Jack had done, quiet, extrajudicial, and far from the oversight of any Senate committee. Came through a back-end trigger-ran automated system that flagged anomalies in field communication patterns and tactical behavior that matched profiles of inactive agents. It didn't trip alarms for law enforcement. It bypassed those. It landed instead on the desk of a woman named Elise Hartwell, who worked in a nondescript subunit of the agency known unofficially as Quiet Continuity. Her job was simple: monitor the world for ghosts. Hartwell wasn't young, but she didn't seem old either. Her office had no windows. Fluorescent lights buzzed above shelves lined with case summaries, migration maps, and photos pinned with notes in Penno AI. No face-tagging software, just pattern recognition. The old way. She read the flag, a signal from a cartel communications. Intercepts someone had described an interrogator in Texas, an old man who asked questions like he already knew the answers. The term Kilo Echo appeared in a verbal account. Buried in a field report, she walked the hallway to the sublevel archive, signing twice, giving a code through a sealed mic, and finally receiving a worn gray binder from a vault attendant who didn't speak. The cover was marked with 3 stripes retired field status. Hartwell opened it slowly. The file was sparse but surgical. 31 confirmed field interrogations for unconfirmed disappearances. No official reprimands. 6 language proficiencies. 3 covert deployments in Central America, none of which technically happened. Final assessment, voluntarily withdrawn from field operations after personal loss. Last update, resides on private property near Del Rio, Texas. Active status, monitored passively. Hartwell skimmed until she found the last authorization. Entry: a 1-sentence note scrawled in pen by a man long retired. If Kilo Echo ever surfaces again, it won't be random. It'll be necessary. She placed the binder on the desk and picked up a secure line. Not many numbers remained active from that era, but one still worked out of Fort Sam Houston, assigned to a man known only as Daniels. He picked up without introduction. "Elise," he said. "I have a flag," she replied. "Texas border. Rancher near Del Rio. 3 cartel men missing. 1 confirmed captured, 1 escaped." He described old methods. Kilo Echo. She paused. "Looks like it." A long silence stretched across the line. "I thought he walked away." Daniels said he did, but something pulled him back. Daniels exhaled slowly. Paper rustled in the background, a folder closing. "I'll make the call. You sure?" she asked. Daniels didn't answer. The line went dead. 2 hours later, a secure call routed through 3 military satellites landed on a civilian landline 20 miles outside Del Rio. It didn't ring like a normal call. The tone was steady, short 3 pulses, a sound only someone trained would recognize. Jack sat in his kitchen, the receiver on the wall, blinking once. He let it blink twice more before he picked up. Nothing was said. On the other end, Daniels waited. Finally, Jack spoke. "I told you, I left that behind." Daniels replied, voice low. "So did we." But the file woke up. Jack looked out the window. The barn was dark. The windmill spun slow. "I'm not calling back," he said. "You already did." The line clicked. Jack stood in silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. He put the receiver back on the hook, poured himself a black cup of coffee, and walked to the back porch. He sat and waited for the next move. The dust hadn't fully settled from the last intrusion when the next one arrived, this time without masks, without machetes, and without hesitation. Just after sunrise, a black SUV came up the gravel road without speeding, as if it belonged. The vehicle was clean, no plates, windows tinted to legal maximum but not a shade beyond. It stopped 10 feet from the barn and idled for exactly 30 seconds before the engine cut. Jack had already been watching from the kitchen window, coffee in hand. Shotgun leaned gently against the doorframe behind him. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. The door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out, mid-50s, trim, no tie, gray windbreaker, over a government tissue collared shirt, the kind you don't buy in stores, the kind issued in quiet departments. His shoes were clean, his hair trimmed high and tight, and his posture was that of someone who hadn't yet shed their rank. Even if the agency had stopped printing it on paper, he didn't walk to the house. He walked to the barn. Jack met him halfway, boots crunching over gravel, stopping with deliberate distance. "Morning," the man said. Jack didn't respond. The man nodded once and looked around, noted the new cables, the new locks. His eyes flicked toward the faint outline of the pit trap, now covered in plywood and loose straw. "You always were thorough," the man added. "Even back in Guayas, I remember the towel trick you used." Jack's face didn't move. "You're not here for memories." "No," the man agreed. "I'm here because someone at Langley dusted off your file. Daniel says you're awake." Jack stared for a long second, then spoke. "Not for you." "Not for me," the man echoed. "But you know what happens when word gets out? the wrong kind of attention. You've got a pile of bodies, 2 captured assets, and a lot of radio silence in a very active corridor. Someone will come asking. Might be us. Might be someone hungrier. Jack crossed his arms. Then you'd best leave now, before someone thinks this was your idea. The man didn't flinch, just adjusted his jacket slightly. I didn't come to threaten, he said, or recruit. I came to offer options. Jack raised one eyebrow. The man continued. We can clean this up, erase some paper trails, or we can make it very public, if that's your preference. You could hand the assets over, say nothing more, go back to your cattle. They're not cattle anymore, Jack replied. The man tilted his head, amused but not smiling. Fair. He stepped a little closer now, not threateningly, just enough to make the point. You're operating out of bounds. No badge, no charter. No one will back you if this escalates. Jack's eyes stayed fixed. I don't need anyone to back me. You're old. I'm enough. Silence hung between them for a moment. Finally, the man said, You know what they used to call you back in Sector 10, before Kilo Echo? Jack didn't answer. Penance, the man said, because they said wherever you showed up, someone was going to pay. Jack's eyes narrowed. And yet they still sent me. They always send the quiet ones when they're done pretending they care. The man looked toward the horizon, then back to Jack. His voice dropped a register. We can cover your trail, or we can watch you burn. I don't have a dog in that fight. But make no mistake, this thing won't stay contained. Jack took one step forward now, just one. Enough. To let the wind shift, this land is mine, he said. And what happens here, stays here. You want to help, go back and erase my name. Again, the man studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket, not fast, not suddenly, and handed Jack a small envelope. Inside, a satellite. Image, time-stamped, showing a new convoy forming south of the border. Then you'll want to know what's coming next. He turned and walked back to the SUV, never looking over his shoulder. Jack stood in place until the vehicle disappeared down the gravel road. Then he opened the envelope again. There were more than trucks on that image. There were faces, and Jack had seen them before. The wind had shifted by nightfall. It wasn't the kind of change you could measure with instruments. It was the silence of birds holding their breath. The way the cattle stood still near the fence line, facing south as if they sensed it too. Jack stood on the back porch, a thermos of black coffee cooling beside him. He'd reviewed the satellite printout again that morning, studied each frame until the blurred heat signatures felt like old acquaintances, faces from long ago. He'd seen under different lights, some in interrogation rooms, some through a scope, all etched into memory. They were coming not to scare this time, not to test defenses. This was a cleanup operation. The cartel didn't like unfinished business, especially when the unfinished part talked, especially when one of their own had limped back across the border. Talking about a farmer with too many questions and eyes like ice, this group wasn't sloppy. They weren't kids. They'd been briefed, armed, and paid. 8 men-4 per truck, moving in coordinated timing. They were ex-police, ex-military, former bodyguards turned freelancers. Their names didn't matter now. What mattered was that they believed this was going to be surgical. Quick in, quick out. But that's the problem with assuming your enemy doesn't have allies. The first pair of headlights appeared just after 2 a.m., cresting the ridge line at the south perimeter. A second vehicle split off, circling toward the canal on the west side, right where the earlier scouts had tried to sneak through. Jack remained calm, his breath even. He didn't move yet. Inside the barn, the floodlight systems stayed dark. The motion sensors were live, silently alerting the control pad in Jack's kitchen. But he wasn't in the kitchen. He was in the tree line, 70 yards east of the barn, kneeling beneath a thermal tarp. His eyes fixed on the advancing formation. Behind him, 20 yards deeper, his old neighbor Walter adjusted the bolt. On a rusted Springfield rifle, the same one he'd carried in Cambodia, Walter didn't speak much anymore, but when Jack had shown him the photos, he'd simply nodded and gone to his attic. That had been enough. At the North Ridge, Jack's son lay prone behind a rock shelf, spotting scope trained on the entry angle. From the highway, the GPS tracker he'd left on Jack had led him back 2 nights earlier. They hadn't talked much, just enough to understand. The son hadn't asked for explanations. But when Jack pointed to the coordinates, the younger man replied, I've got your 6. The cartel's timing was tight. The first team reached the barn door by 2:18. They moved in triangle formation, silent, scanning. The second team took the perimeter. One man stayed with each vehicle, engine idling low. Then it started. A sharp click of pressure switch at the base of the barn ramped triggered a signal. A floodlight overhead exploded into brightness, disorienting the forward crew. At the same moment, Walter fired the first shot, taking out the man nearest the gas tank of the lead truck. The vehicle erupted in sparks, not an explosion, just enough fire to draw panic. Jack moved next, breaking from cover to intercept the flanking team near the canal. He didn't shoot to kill. He disarmed, redirected, took knees out from behind. With shocking precision, one man screamed. Another fell backward into the mud, choking on water as Jack vanished into the dark again. The sun called in positions by radio short-clipped. 2 down. 1 regrouping near fence. Movement near West Trail. The remaining cartel men tried to fall back, but the path they'd used to enter had been spiked with Keltrup's old school. Nothing digital. They scattered, slipping, yelling, into radios that weren't connected to anything anymore. Jack had jammed the channel before the trucks even arrived. By 2:34, only 3 remained standing. They huddled near the second truck, pinned. Jack stepped out, then no mask, no disguise. Just him, walking into the headlights, holding a flare in one hand. "You won't get another try," he said, voice steady. The men didn't respond. One raised his weapon but didn't fire. Another turned and ran into the dark. Jack didn't chase, because this wasn't about catching every last one. This was about sending a message, the kind no one could misinterpret. The hard drives weren't hidden. They didn't need to be. Anyone who made it far enough to find them wouldn't be walking out. In the corner of the tool shed, wired through conduits that looked like old irrigation lines, was the server Jack had built with his own hands years ago, in anticipation of something he hoped would never come. For drives, redundant backups. A silent fan barely humming beneath layers of dust and heat shielding. It had recorded everything, not just the chaos of gunfire and confusion outside the barn, but what came before and after. The ambush had begun at 2:13 a.m., but the real leverage came after the smoke cleared. 2 cartel enforcers had surrendered by dawn. One dropped his weapon the moment Jack stepped into view. The other hesitated, blood running down his sleeve, before collapsing to his knees. Walter secured them with plastic zip cuffs, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Jack had already returned. To the barn's back room, the one beneath the floorboards, where the older cameras still functioned without a hint of static, the room was sterile. Cold concrete walls, a single table, a pair of folding chairs, a drain in the middle of the floor. Not because of anything Jack planned to do, but because the memory of what used to happen in rooms like this lingered, quietly. In the design, he brought only one of the men below, the younger one, the one with a nervous twitch in his left eye, who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting anyone to call him back. Jack didn't speak at first. He simply set a recorder on the table. The red light blinked once, then it stayed on. The man started talking before he was asked a single question. Names came first, then routes, then payment chains. The boy spoke like someone who hadn't been trained in silence. Or maybe like someone who had never expected to be on the receiving end of questions designed to break professionals. Jack's method hadn't changed. It was still built on patience, still quiet, still devastating. Upstairs, the son watched the security feeds in real time from the converted pantry, now filled with screens and patched cables. He didn't interrupt, but he saw the moment the young man began to weep. Jack pressed a button on the wall. The table camera zoomed in slowly. Clear audio, crystal picture. "You think you're alone out here," the boy said. "But they know. They sent us because they knew you'd killed scouts. They wanted to clean it up. That's what they do." Jack leaned forward, silent. "There's another team," the boy added. "Not cartel. Hired from outside. They don't care if it's you or your neighbors or the sheriff. Just names on a list. You're on it." Jack didn't blink. He stood, walked to the corner, and flipped a second switch. Data backed itself up to an offsite server, encrypted upload, silent transmission, bouncing through layers of satellite. Redirection.insurance. By 6 a.m., he had the footage clipped, timestamped, and compressed into a package no larger than a USB stick. One copy was mailed. Another was locked in a steel container beneath the root cellar. A third burned 2 discs and sealed inside the lining of an old leather saddlebag. Walter saw it happen, nodded once, then returned to cleaning the rifle. The son didn't ask where. The data was going, he knew. Leverage wasn't just about protection. It was about memory. Proof, documentation that couldn't be refuted, explained away, or buried by the same bureaucracies that had once erased Jack's name. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, Jack had already set the footage to trigger a release protocol if anything happened to him, any failure of movement, any unexplained silence longer than a few hours. One button, one schedule, one ripple effect that would spread far beyond the county. Because this was no longer about defending a barn dot, this was about control, and Jack had just taken it back. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and hand-delivered. No return address, no fingerprints, just a padded manila sleeve passed discreetly from a courier to the aid of Senator Marianne. Keller, during an off-the-record breakfast in El Paso, the senator hadn't planned to be there long, just enough time to shake hands, offer condolences about the recent cartel activity in the region, and quietly review talking points for an upcoming security briefing. But the moment her aide whispered, "This just came for you," and slid the envelope beneath her stack of folders, something shifted in her posture. Back in her hotel suite, with the curtains drawn and the news playing low in the background, she opened it. Inside was a small flash drive taped to a folded index card. One sentence was written in blocky black pen. "They don't just run drugs." When the video started, it was grainy, then sharpened as the codec settled. The camera was angled low but clear. A young man sat at a folding table in a concrete room. Behind him, silence. His hands trembled. The subtitles were hard-coded. Spanish, English, name after name, town after town, payoffs, drop locations, officials in uniforms, some in suits. One of them barely blurred was a man she had shaken hands with just last year at a border conference. Smiling before a line of flags, the tape ran 21 minutes. No violence, no threats, just the kind of testimony that makes entire institutions pause. She copied the file twice, once to her secure drive, once to a private external disk she kept inside the lining of her luggage. She then made a call to no one on record, a burner line reserved for emergencies. When the man on the other end answered, she didn't identify herself. She just said, "You need to watch this, and you need to start cleaning house." Within 48 hours, 3 government contractors with known ties to northern Mexican infrastructure projects resigned for personal reasons. One disappeared entirely. A fourth, a customs official based in Brownsville, failed to report for duty and was later found attempting to board a flight to Guatemala under a false name. No statements were made publicly, but behind closed doors, gears began to turn. Senate staffers were reshuffled. A pending bill on rural border surveillance was quietly tabled. The funding earmarked for a security partnership initiative vanished from the draft without explanation, and the senator received a thin envelope in return no name again. But inside was a printed sheet with 6 new names. Above them, in red ink, connected to La Ruta del Corvo. She'd never heard of that route before, but intelligence briefings soon revealed it was a covert corridor bypassing major checkpoints, stretching from Tamaulipas to small Texas towns like Delphi and Hermosa. Ridge places no one thought mattered. The confessions on the tape had named Delphi, a shell company, an abandoned ranch, unusual power usage. And in the corner of that footage, barely visible in the last frame, was a pair of boots. Not the speakers, not the interrogators, just standing in shadow, watching. Senator Keller didn't ask where the tape had come from. She didn't have to. The markings on the index card matched an old interagency shorthand once used in black. Site documentation KE Kilo Echo Dot. She remembered the name from a restricted memo years ago. A contractor turned instructor turned ghost. The file had been sealed at the highest level, decommissioned with honor. But this was not the work of someone retired. This was someone active. Someone who had decided the game was too dirty to be played from the sidelines anymore by the end of the week. 2 more cartel-linked businessmen in Monterey vanished without trace. No ransom, no notes, just silence. And somewhere, in the quiet reaches of rural Texas, a man returned a spade to its place behind a feed bin, brushed dust from a wooden shelf, and poured himself a cup of coffee as if none of it had ever happened. But the tape had gone out, and it would not be the last. The mornings returned to silence, but it was not the same kind of quiet. Before, it had been the stillness of isolation. Now it was a quieter kind of presence, one shaped by knowledge rather than absence. Jack rose at 5:30 each morning, as always, the coffee brewed in the dented percolator, the cattle load at the same time. The perimeter walks resumed, boots pressing familiar grooves into the sandy trail that looped past the barn, the canal, the distant fence line, but now there was a faint hum behind the wind. Near the utility pole by the eastern edge of the property stood a gray metal box, freshly mounted, where the weathered wood split from years of sun exposure. It looked like an updated transformer at a glance. The lineman who installed it said nothing, their truck unmarked, their presence brief. It wasn't from the electric cope. Jack didn't ask. He already knew. Inside that box, a Lorbit satellite uplink, secure channel, always transmitting, not broadcasting, but listening. Ready to send if prompted, it pulsed every 3 minutes, heartbeats soft and invisible, feeding encrypted pings back to a server well outside the continental US, not to Langley, not directly. Something older, something deeper in the system designed for people who no longer had desks, who hadn't been assigned a badge in decades. The kind of network that remembered its own ghosts. Jack never looked at it directly. He'd just nod toward the pole in passing, as if checking the wire tension. The barn had been repaired. The old door replaced with a reinforced slide panel, painted the same faded red as before. The hinges didn't creak anymore. The lock was coated now, though. Jack still kept a key on a chain around his neck out of habit, more than necessity. Walter didn't visit as often. Once every few weeks, a silent arrival, a few shared tools passed back and forth, a wordless acknowledgement over black coffee. They didn't speak of what had happened, not because it was taboo, but because it was finished. And in their world, something finished didn't need revisiting. Unless it became unfinished again, the sun hadn't returned. Not officially, but Jack knew someone had repaired the trail cam behind the northern ridge without saying so. The wiring was cleaner than his own. The mount was military issue. It picked up motion at 800 yards. Jack let it stay. Local chatter died down quickly. The gunfire had been explained away as poachers, a power line rupture. Rumors, yes, but rural towns were good at letting certain stories sink below the surface. The sheriff didn't ask questions. Jack brought in pies to the church potluck again. He nodded in line at the feed store. Life, to the casual observer, looked as it always had. But Jack didn't fall asleep with the windows open anymore. He kept the backup radio by the nightstand, and every Thursday, at exactly 8:42 p.m., he pulled the landline from its cradle, listened to one ring, and replaced it without saying a word. Just a signal, still here, still watching. The goats avoided the southeast corner of the pasture now. Animals remembered things people couldn't see. The ground there had been turned to recently. A patch of soil, not like the rest. Jack let the grass grow tall over it. He didn't write anything down, didn't keep journals, logs, or summaries. The camera servers kept the timeline. The drive under the floor still spun silently once every 4 hours to avoid degradation. And yet, life returned. Tomatoes in the garden bed, a broken post, mended windmill blades, finally repaired after 5 years of groaning. Routine, once again, but not out of habit, out of control. He was never assigned another mission. No calls came from former handlers, no men in suits appeared with new dossiers. But the box on the pole kept blinking, and Jack Landry, 74, retired interrogator, and part-time cattleman, fed the chickens just the same. The diner buzzed with its usual hump forks clinking on plates, the hiss of bacon on the griddle, and the low static of the radio playing old country hits through a dust-covered speaker. Locals came and went in their dusty boots and faded jeans, some stopping for a quick coffee, others settling into booths that had shaped their backs over years. At a table near the window, 2 younger ranch hands laughed over something one of them had seen on his drive-in. "You see that, old fella? On the Lawson Trail, Jack Landry, I swear, he was out there herding chickens like they owed him money." The other chuckled, not unkindly. "Man's been doing the same loop since I was in middle school. Keeps to himself. Probably thinks we're all a bunch of soft kids." The waitress Pearl glanced toward them but said nothing. She'd known Jack longer than most of them had been alive. Knew what he ordered without asking. Black coffee, no sugar, side of toast he barely touched. She also knew he'd hear the comment. He always did, even if he didn't show it. Jack sat at the far end of the counter, same stool every time, one hand cradling his coffee cup, the other resting on his thigh. His flannel shirt had the elbows worn through, and his boots carried a line of dried mud that hadn't come off since the last hard rain. He didn't laugh, he didn't scowl either, just smiled faintly. A small, unreadable curve that didn't reach his eyes. Pearl refilled his cup. No words exchanged, just a nod. At that same moment, nearly 900 miles south, in a hacienda with reinforced gates and black SUVs parked out front, a man scrolled through a tablet in silence. He was younger than Jack, but not by much, though the weight of command and years of violence had aged him fast. His name rarely appeared in photos, and when it did, they never lasted long. Men called him El Aguila behind closed doors. The ones who didn't ended up as examples. He stared at a digital map marked with colored routes, each line a corridor of power drug shipments, weapons, bodies, money. His organization controlled them all with ruthless efficiency. But one route, highlighted in yellow, blinked slowly. It connected a quiet stretch of scrubland in northern Mexico to a forgotten road just past the Texas border. 2 weeks ago, it had been active for men assigned to teams lost. No intel returned. One panicked voice message from a half-dead scout was the last trace. Then silence. He played that message again. The voice cracked, trembling. He wasn't normal. He knew my name before. I gave it. He asked questions I didn't know. I remembered. I couldn't lie. I couldn't think. He'd made me talk. El Aguila didn't reply, didn't threaten. He just looked at the map one last time, then tapped the yellow route. With a single fingertip, delete, the line vanished from the screen. Not rerouted, not paused, erased. That land was no longer a path. It was a wall. No explanation given to his subordinates, just a silent order. Don't go there again. Back at the diner, Jack sipped the last of his coffee. His movements were slow, but not tired. He placed a few bills on the counter, exact change as always, then stood with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. He tipped his hat at Pearl, nodded at the two young men who suddenly felt unsure if their joke had been funny, at Allen, walked out into the morning sun as the door creaked shut behind him. One of the ranch hands leaned over to the other and muttered, "You ever wonder what that guy did before the farm?" The other shrugged, then watched Jack disappear down the street, step steady, back straight. Whatever it was, it had left something behind, and no one, not even they, were laughing anymore.